Hello.
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 Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are delighted to be together in Instagram Live. And I have to say that it's the first time that we do this. I have done hundreds of presentations with the films, but never have done this. And I've been trusted by my team to be the one who initiates this. So bear with me because I'm not the technical one. I'm the one who calls the technical people to help. So thank you for joining us and thank you for being here with us. We are here to talk about milk. We are talking about the milk educational program, and we're going to tell you what we are doing, what we are up to, and invite you all to join us in this effort to support moms and caregivers and healthcare workers, and most important, babies, and receive them with a good light. Just to brief you a little bit, for the ones who have not seen milk, which I hope a lot of you have, but if you haven't, please visit the website at milkhood.com, browse the website, watch the trailer, and go to the milk educational program and see what we have been up to and what are we doing. Just to give you a little bit of a background, what is the milk educational program? Back in 2017, when we were doing a lot of screenings around the world with milk, it was obvious that the audience had a lot of questions, a lot of needs to further education, and that the film was a catalyst to open up the discussion. So we created the milk educational program that went around the world with a lot of success. I'm proud to say that a lot of implementation of changes in communities globally came as a result of the milk educational program. So now in 2023, thanks to the support of the Telos Fund, who has been a great supporter of the film from the very beginning and now celebrating their 10th anniversary, and Milk being the firstborn film that they supported and that gave them as a firstborn a lot of satisfaction, invited us to bring back milk with the milk educational program. And in thinking about strategies and what moms and babies might need at this time, at a time where we are faced with a world that is really upside down, with a world that is in a lot of emergency, with climate change scaring us day by day, the strategy has been to create a program that will actually be able to help moms and babies at the time of an emergency. And more than anything, be preventative and prepare them in these occasions. So if anything should ever happen, they will know what to do. This is a topic that is overlooked by the media, is overlooked by pretty much everyone. We hear about hundreds of thousands of people that have been misplaced due to wildfires here in Canada over the summer. And we don't hear what's the situation with moms and babies. So that's our program. That's what we are here to do. And we partner with Safely Fed Canada, which we are very proud to work with. And I have the pleasure of introducing you here that you can see live, Michelle Branco and Jodine Chase, who have been wonderful to work together and to create a very, very insightful educational program that follows the screening of milk in different communities. So I'm going to give the word to both these beautiful ladies that have been accompanying during months of preparation to do this, just to tell us a little bit, Michelle and Jodine, tell the audience what we have been up to and where we've been, and some of the success stories that we can already share.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. We're really excited, and we are also, I'm doing my first live, and I admit it is also a little stressful for me too. Same with Jodine too. I thought you might have done one before, but clearly we're all into this. So please bear with us. So to give you a little bit of background on why we were so interested when Noemi came to us about this program, Jodine, I think, was involved in the making, in the process of the making of Milk, because she had talked about this film that was coming, and we had the opportunity to see it with so many different kinds of audiences and see how powerful it was and how much it moved people. And as we exited the pandemic and started to kind of rethink what Safely Fed was going to do, the gaps that were part of the reason why the organization was formed in the first place after the Fort McMurray wildfires in 2016 were all that much more apparent and all that much more acute, particularly as we started to understand that the rate and the intensity of the natural disasters that affect so many communities right across the country are really accelerating, and they're becoming more significant in places where we hadn't had that before. So this was an opportunity for us to take the power of Milk and the power of it to inspire and to really help people reflect on their own experiences, and move it into an educational program using some of the great work that you've done in Kenya and other places. So we were very excited, and we were especially excited to be able to sort of pick up two of those really key themes around the emergencies and the commercial influence on infant feeding, and really work those into a workshop. And so that was really the catalyst for the reasoning for us, and we feel like that the film has been such an important central part of that conversation, and the opportunity to do that with you and with the community partners that we're joining across the country has been amazing. We put lots of kilometers on the car, going to put lots more on there. Jodine's going to, I think, get a few more air miles than I did that I'm managing. But Jodine, I wonder if you might want to talk a little bit about just what we've heard so far in the places that we've been.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. We've so far we have we did a tour of what we all like to refer to as Central Canada, here in the West. So I joined Michelle in Toronto and Noemi as well, and we visited Toronto, the Tyendinaga Mohawk First Nation, Ottawa, and Montreal. And I really was very apprehensive, to be honest, about how this was actually going to play out. You know, it makes sense to us. You've seen the film. We've seen how the film has such power to move people and to call people to action. But that's us. And we were really curious to see what this would be like in community. And right from the very beginning, the gathering in Toronto, Michelle, that we first attended with a group of families who came, a lot of people who brought newborns and young babies. I think there were 8 babies in that, of about 40 people in that theater. And, you know, right away I realized that the very questions that we are hoping that people will ask are exactly the questions that came at the end of the film. I found that to be just so gratifying, because it's those families right now that are holding babies in their arms, that are absolutely impacted, and that have the potential to, you know, to support themselves and to support their communities in resilience, if we can only just, you know, give them just the tiniest nudge or the tiniest bit of support to jump in and do what's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that's just amazing, is when the questions that you would have planted in the audience are exactly what the parents ask. And especially in community screenings where we have parents who don't have the sort of the pre-reading that a lot of our professional colleagues have had, and they ask, they know, they catch on right away. And that's one of the interesting things about this work, is that when you start to talk to people about it, it doesn't take a lot of convincing, because it's pretty clear what needs to be done and why it's important. And certainly for us, I know that when we first started doing this work, we leaned so hard on the expertise and the knowledge and the years of experience and research that our colleagues throughout the world have built over time, and we borrowed from that. And one of the challenges that we've come up against has been that while we have a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of expertise in so many of these areas, and we have lots of resources to lean on and lots of traditional knowledge to lean on too, the cold weather guidance and the cold weather work has been very hard to come by, because it just hasn't been developed, because it hasn't been common in the places where we see the most natural disasters and armed conflicts, sadly, too.
Yeah, absolutely right.
You know,
Mhm.
we have been dealing through the summer with the wildfires, and most of the workshops have been around the wildfires and talking about the displacement. We are going into cold weather right now, so maybe we can share a little bit with the audience. How are we planning to prepare the frontline workers and the moms and the babies, so when facing blizzards or facing storms, or if they have to be displaced or any kind of emergency that they will have, how can we prevent any problems and how can we prepare for that? So maybe we can share a little bit about what are the challenges and how can we overcome that.
Yeah, I think that one of the most interesting conversations that I can recall, which really underscores why I think we're well positioned in our country. We have expertise. We just haven't translated it yet in ways that I don't think we've really come to terms with it in some ways. But Michelle and I, right after we formed Safely Fed Canada in Montreal, to talk about this work. And a lot of times, the first thing that we do is we try to get a sense of who in the group that we're speaking with, who has had direct experience in being involved in an emergency, who's had been in an emergency situation or a disaster, who has had to evacuate with an infant. And what I wasn't expecting, because in my mind, the Montreal ice storm, the big ice storm where people were without power in some cases for many weeks, was very distant. It seemed very distant in my mind. But right away, people raised their hands and said, I remember the ice storm. I remember being, I just had a baby and my baby was 2 weeks old and we had no power. I remember some younger people remembered living through it as younger, as children and as adolescents. But it was really clear that these were really important moments in their lives. And at the same time, I was really struck by how, even though there was a lot of expertise in the room, done, had experienced some hardship, but had done all the right things. Like there's one woman who talked about when the power went out, just getting into bed with her littles, and they all got together skin to skin because that was keeping them warm under the covers. They had no idea how long it was going to go. And we do have understanding and expertise, and we do have the ability to, to support our families in ways that if we think about it, if we can, talk on the phone or chat with other people, it's not too hard to come to these answers. But right away, there were people that were in that room who had lived through this and had experience and who were ready to step up and say, this is what I did then, and let me tell my story and let me talk about what I think is important for people to know. So, how many years ago was that now, Michelle? That was probably 6 or 7 years ago.
7, because it would have been 2016,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And it just really, really stuck with me. And then what also stuck with me was I hear these stories of folks in a place like Canada who go without power for a few days, for a few weeks. And then we talk to our colleagues and our friends and people that live way up north who kind of chuckle and say, well, you're old.
Yeah.
you know, you don't have the right tools. I know we've had some really amazing insight from our friends in the Northwest Territories and in are have in some ways brought to life, and in some this has not ever gone away. I've been utilizing the special what we call a parka and what they call a muti, where they've been carrying their babies inside parkas naked and skin to skin, access to the breast for many thousands of years. So I think sometimes we don't necessarily think about the fact that we do have the deep cultural knowledge right here in Canada to address these cold weather hazards.
So what do you recommend moms and babies when there is an emergency with hygiene? How do you keep water? How do you keep the bottle? And of course, we want to make sure that mom is breastfeeding, but that mom might not be breastfeeding. And in that case, what happens? She's displaced. She's not at home.
Yeah.
What is the recommendation?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to have thought of this before you're in the moment. I mean, be prepared, right? The Boy Scouts taught us that from the beginning. Certainly, these conversations and sort of thinking through what you would do if you lost power for 24 hours, for 3 days, for a week, for 2 weeks, what that looks like, what you would need to move if you suddenly needed to leave your home because there was something, flooding or some sort of other kind of incident. What would you need in the winter to bring with you? So I think that one of the questions that we had as we were coming in was, what would you need to put in your car kit if you have a young baby? So you might have, you know, a shovel and some things to dig your car out if it's stuck, but what else do you need in terms of blankets, in terms of some snacks, in terms of water? Those sorts of things are preparing ahead of time. Much of the time, you're going to be able to shelter at home, so you're not necessarily needing to move. But understanding things like, you know, the importance of skin-to-skin contact. We have a tendency to think that when it's cold, you bundle up and you kind of tuck the baby away where they're warm and safe. But in fact, it's really hard for especially a young baby to keep their body heat going. So in those, they really need an adult against them to generate that heat so that they can stay together. So understanding that, which is something that we don't really need to talk about in most parts of the country, although our friends in the north certainly are very familiar with the concept. So those sorts of things is really around having that plan and having those little pieces of knowledge. From a hygiene perspective, certainly the issue around, you know, if you don't have running water because your pipes are frozen or because the pipes are frozen elsewhere in your city, understanding how to boil water to make it clean, the safety of using snow, the safety of using bottled water, those sorts of things. So we, as much as possible, we want to use, you know, municipal tap water that we know is safe. The secondary choice would be bottled water, but we don't always have that. And then when we get into other things, we need to start thinking about like a risk assessment. So we might use, you know, we don't have a lot of water, we might use melted snow to wash our hands, and we'll use the bottled water to prepare the foods, those sorts of things. But really, the really key thing is to think about it ahead of time and understand where you are. So someone who's in rural Newfoundland, who's 5 or 6 hours drive on a good day from a health facility, is going to be in a really different position than someone who lives in a condo in downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver, whose issue might be not so much the distance to help, but the distance to the ground, right? Because if the power goes out, you've got 20 stories to go down with a baby. And you're definitely not bringing your stroller at that point. So you know that's not happening. So knowing, just sort of thinking about where you are and what you would do. The other piece is really having those contacts, right? So having the numbers that you would need to call, the people that you would need to call on a physical piece of paper, so that if your phone dies or it gets damaged or there's some sort of major catastrophic failure of power or communications, that you have a way to contact the people you need to contact.
Right. So, well, be prepared in all the
Be
ways.
prepared.
But, you know, the word emergency, the word disaster is already something that we try to stay away from. We don't want to hear about that. And climate change has really affected all of us. And we are not talking about war. We are not talking about earthquakes, but it's happening around the world. We are going with a program to Turkey. We are starting in a few weeks because of the aftermath of the earthquake. So it's important to understand what happens in situations like that, and hopefully here in Canada we don't have to worry about that, but we know that BC is preparing for big floods coming up from what happened just now in Acapulco a few days ago, and who knows if it's coming north. So all of those things are important right now in this particular moment of life, which is unfortunate. We have to be prepared for all of this. And these conversations that nobody wants to have are very, very important. And one of the things that I'm curious about what your take is, there's a lot of pregnant women. We heard, for example, in Turkey, there's 14,000 women that are pregnant, ready to give birth after right now, and there's no facilities, there's nothing. That's their biggest problem. There's got to be maybe not that big number, or maybe bigger number here in Canada. What happens under an emergency? How does that pregnant woman and her husband or her partner or her parents or whoever she's with be able to help her at that time.
Well, it may not be 14,000 people that are about to give birth in one particular part of the country in an emergency setting, but there are no question every time there's an emergency or an evacuation, there are families that are about to birth, there are families that do birth during evacuations, and there are families that are need to be supported to birth as soon as they arrive. You know, as soon as they arrive, babies don't stop being born, no matter where they are.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, one of the things about in terms of preparation is that as you head into this winter season, you know that you're very pregnant. So that's one of the things that you can foresee, right? So if you're heading into a winter season where you know that there's more likely to be storms and those kinds of disruptions, you know that that's something that you should make as part of your plan. I think most families have access to healthcare providers, so having a little bit of a conversation, especially as you start to get a little bit later in your pregnancy, about when you're going to go to the hospital. Part of that is also going to be what happens if you are unexpectedly in a situation where you can't get access to help or help is slowed down. What kinds of things should you think about? And I think one of the problems that we have in our society in general is we don't talk a whole lot about birth, and people don't really have a whole lot of idea necessarily of how it happens, which is one of the beautiful things about your film, because it shares that with an audience in a way that's so felt both in the heart and in the body, and I think that that's actually one of the really powerful parts of the film. But that parents should understand, if a baby comes unexpectedly, that we are able to take care of that. We're going to take, a couple of things. Again, the skin to skin, keeping the baby against us. One of the challenges, especially if it's cold and people are feeling threatened, is they automatically want to rub the baby down, wrap them up in a thick blanket, and put them aside while we help the mom. What we really want to do is keep the mom and baby together. So if we can communicate to people that, in general, that when you have a mother and a baby, a parent and a baby who've just birthed, keeping the parent and the baby together is like job one. The rest we can kind of work through. We can get, phone calls and emergency responders and so forth. But if we can keep the parent and the baby together after that birth, we've done a whole lot to protect them both. So that's one thing, really, if we can start to tell the general public about that information, because it likely won't happen to most of us, but it might come across our lives at some point. And definitely the other piece, I think, is just acknowledging that when we have a challenging birth, that we're going to need to spend some time sort of coming back together. So that parents who've been in an emergency during that early postpartum period, or who've given birth in the middle of a disaster, are going to need some extra support from their family and from their friends, not just in that period, that immediate period during the disaster, but also as they heal and they come back from that. So that's something certainly in the communities like in the north, where we had lots of evacuations, babies who were born away, babies who had just been born who were moved away in that period. Certainly those families need extra support, not just during the disaster, but beyond that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
well, sorry.
I was saying, I honestly think that we try to overcomplicate things in our modern world, and I think that if there's one take-home message for people, is that we talk about skin to skin in the first few hours after birth, and we talk about skin to skin here. We've been discussing it as an option to keep people warm in cold weather. But what I really think people need to hear is that skin to skin becomes life-saving, whether it's a birth that's outside of the kind of care that was anticipated or outside of a facility, or whether it is in those hours or days, or even weeks later, if we don't have the right kind of shelter. It really is a life-saving practice, and we're influenced a lot. Noemi, I know you know this. We're influenced by what we see in our modern culture. So we see in our modern culture is the baby is born. We don't see women's bodies in birth on television. We at best we see women birthing with clothing on, and as Michelle was saying, the baby's bundled up. And it's actually thinking and wrapping our heads around and processing ahead of time, this anticipatory, what would happen? Well, the first thing is that I am going to make sure this baby is still skin to skin, right, attached to me, and I'm going to keep away everybody that tries to take the baby away from me. We need to empower mothers, and we need to empower families. We need to empower the caregivers, the supporters of grandmothers, to really envelop the two together and support the two together. And it is just such an important piece. Skin to skin is life-saving after birth. When for mother and for baby, you know, it reduces the risk of postpartum hemorrhage. It increases the viability, like the babies regulate their heart rate and they regulate their temperature. But then you can extend this concept. So whether it's keeping a newborn and a mother that's just birthed together, or whether supporting a mother to care for her toddler together. Our instinct, I think, often is to help the mother and to help the family by taking the burden away from her. And we translate it in our minds to taking the baby away from her in an emergency setting. That can actually really cause problems. It's so disruptive to do that. So keeping the two together has got to be the takeaway message if we get nothing else across tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you know, we deal a lot in the film with the commercialization and the politics of birth and infant feeding. There's a lot of that that we discuss because it's part of what interrupts that natural that you're talking about, Jodine. It really interrupts the natural process of that mom and that baby together. The commercialization of birth, if we are talking about birth, we have seen it in Brazil with 90% cesareans and in many other places in the world. And when we talk about breastfeeding, well, we have the infiltration of formula companies that come in. And since the pandemic, we know that there's billions of dollars that are spent in marketing to bring that formula in. But in an emergency situation, when there is no water, that parent has been displaced, when there's no hygiene that you were talking about, Michelle, we all like gifts, but we're measuring the consequences. So what advice and what can we tell the people that are with us right now in a sync way, because we want to give a glimpse here of what we are all about in the real work that we do with the Milk Educational Program, but at least a glimpse of, you know, what do we do in situations like that?
You know, I think you've nailed exactly the issue. We have a desire to help, and our focus in our social sort of values is that we help with things. So we find things that will help the person, and that is how we help, as opposed to nurturing the relationship. So rather than trying to find a product that's a solution, we need to really focus on supporting the relationship, because the relationship is really the key thing that makes the products work, right? So if you have a product and you don't have a parent who cares about a baby, it doesn't matter how much infant formula you have. It doesn't matter how much clean water you have, because if you don't have a person who's going to prepare that and lovingly feed it responsibly to the baby, they're not going to be okay regardless. So I think that's one of the things, is really we need to start remembering that parenting is about relationships. It's about a connection between a human baby and a human parent. And that our solutions have to be about those relationships, not about products. We use products all the time in emergencies. It's one of the most horrendously wasteful spaces on the planet is humanitarian response, because there's just an extraordinary amount of garbage involved. But at the same time, when we're talking about families and we're talking about parents and babies and that period, that really tender period where that child is completely dependent on an adult, if they don't have a relationship and they don't have an adult who cares about them, it really doesn't matter. So I think that's one of the pieces we really talk about. Like, we have a tendency to talk about, this is breastfeeding, this is, you know, solids, this is formula feeding, but really from the perspective of the helper, it's about the person who's in front of you and nurturing that connection between the parent and the baby. And the parent knows what the baby needs. We just need to listen to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So David, let us know and let the audience know, where are we going now with the program? What's the next step? Because we are into the second leg of the milk education. We've done a little bit of the East Coast, I would call it, of Canada, but now where are we going?
Well, I am going to be staying close to home and visiting one of my favorite places in the city. I'm going to be at the Toronto Birth Centre on November 10th. We're going to be sitting with the community members in that neighborhood and the midwives and the health workers who work out of the Toronto Birth Centre, along with the Okama Collective, who also were our co-hosts at our first Toronto sessions. And then I think, but right before that, Jodine, you're going to be in Victoria, right?
In Victoria, yeah. There's a screening on Tuesday, November 7th in the evening at Spectrum Community School, and we're really looking forward to there. I think that it's, you mentioned earlier, yes, it's okay, I dropped my phone into my lap earlier. Now it's very steady.
Can't bring you to anywhere.
I'm not the one to do the technical, and I told you, I warned that.
Oh, there we go. Looking forward to connecting particularly with families, because I know that every year in British Columbia there's this big shakeout thing they have where everybody talks about preparedness for the big one, for the big earthquake. But I'm really interested in listening to what families who are part of a big preparedness program, what they have to say and what they're looking for, what their concerns are and what their fears are. And I'm looking forward to their perspective after seeing the film, Noemi.
Mm-hmm.
And then Michelle, the week after, so I'm in there, so that's November 7th in Victoria, and then you're going to be November 10th in Toronto, and then we're both going up to Yellowknife. I think this is a really special screening. I'm going to let you talk about it because I'm losing my voice, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we were very honored to be invited to join the Midwives Association of the Northwest Territories and the Naturopathic Doctors of the Northwest Territories in Yellowknife, particularly after that that community was evacuated this summer and have now returned. And that's going to be a really special opportunity, because parents, we were chatting with some of the organizers today, and we said, is there any way we can sort of help people understand why this is important? And their comment was, oh no, they understand why this is important right now. And that's definitely true. I mean, that's what we found in communities when we went into Fort McMurray after the wildfire evacuation there. I have never seen a more committed and persistent audience for our work, because they really understood it, not just in theory, but in their bodies and in their bones, and so in their very, very near memories. So that's going to be a really interesting opportunity, and I think we'll learn at least as much as we share with them, for sure. And then we're off to Edmonton on the 3rd, right, Jodine? The 3rd of December. I think you'll be there in Edmonton, and then we'll probably be announcing a couple more as we get organized, and there may be a couple that bleed into January and February as we get people organized as well.
Yes, there's a growing amount of interest. I just had someone reach out today who is interested in bringing this program to one of our universities where there's a midwifery education program. So I think we'll start to hear some more interest there. But there's no question. People know that this is needed. I don't have enough fingers on either of my hands to count up the recent emergencies and disasters, many of which are overlaid onto other emergencies. And all of us, of course, are just coming out the other side of COVID-19. But there are some communities that had to deal with floods or wildfires, or tornadoes, while they were also dealing with an active pandemic. It's become so urgent.
Yeah, and it's so often overlooked, and that's why the importance of talking about it, right? Because we don't hear it in the media.
No, and yet we know that an emergency disaster, the impact on the community, we see immediately that some of the people that are impacted the most are families with very young children. We know that families who are breastfeeding, they lose their breastfeeding very quickly, and it's not because they don't wish to continue, but because we don't have systems in place to support that. We also know that our communities are, in supporting birthing people, we're experiencing more and more challenges. There are challenges around facilities that are closing, maternity care facilities are closing, and our healthcare workers are really stretched. And so communities that are already in a maternity care crisis are really, really vulnerable when we have even the smallest of interruptions of our system. So, I mean, this is just such a timely conversation.
We have a few questions from the audience. So I'll start with the first one here. What has been the biggest challenge in implementation?
I think actually the biggest challenge has been getting the attention, given how many competing priorities there are. And when we first started doing this work, and I sat down with some of our colleagues who had been doing this a long time, and I just said, I just don't understand how it is that we have emergency plans in place for pets. We have emergency plans in place for elderly people, for all sorts of different vulnerable groups in the community. But for some reason, we don't seem to include babies in that. And the explanation sort of made sense to me at the time, which was the assumption is that babies have an adult, a parent who's looking after them, and that they already know how to do that. So I think that's one of the challenges, is that a lot of the care work that we do is not acknowledged as something needing resources. It's something we just do in our daily lives, so nobody really pays attention to, how the baby wipes and the diapers get to the house and get, dispersed through a week. But those are things that, when in an emergency, the things that you would normally do in your own home, you can't do anymore. So it's really that support. And there's a gendered aspect to that as well, right? So the work that women do in their homes to care for their families is not acknowledged as being important. But in an emergency, when they can't do that work anymore, it's suddenly extremely obvious. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is really getting that understanding of the kinds of things that people need and what happens when they don't. And it's going to be a challenge, because there are an enormous number of priorities in the emergency management field right now, because of the acceleration and the changes in patterns that have existed for decades are suddenly now no longer reliable. So it's going to be really important that we put the needs of infants and babies and pregnant people at the forefront of those conversations, because the consequences of not doing that cast a really long shadow over families. And that's something that we've seen over and over and over again. And part of it is also going to be addressing the myths that are pervasive about birth and pregnancy and infant feeding in society in general, that then get magnified when you get into an emergency too.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. There's another question here. If baby formula has been frozen, is it safe to thaw it and use it?
That depends. So generally speaking, like powder that's frozen and thawed, I'm not overly worried about. Frozen containers, there can be bulging, so you can break a seal even if you can't tell. So that's one aspect of it. And freezing once and thawing once is likely not a problem. But if, for example, you had liquid formula in your car, it's going to freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw. And that's where you start to get a little bit more concerned about contamination or quality. So in general, it depends. If it's a one-time thing, you know how long it's been frozen and what's happened to it. That's one thing, but certainly something that's been in a car or been in a home where the power's been on and off, so we don't know what's been going on with it. That's something to be cautious with.
Another comment here. Sorry, Jodine, you want to add to that? I'm sorry.
I would add on, because I think one of the other things that has come up for people very practically is when you have some formula that's frozen or breast milk that's frozen. Although often if you have breast milk that's frozen, you are also breastfeeding. And many people that have formula that's frozen are also breastfeeding. But if you need to feed the baby and you have something that's frozen and it's a really large solid block, and you're in a very cold environment where you don't have a lot of heat, you want to consider what you want to do to reheat that. Now, of course, if you're able to reheat it, if you still have fuel, then you're able to reheat it, using the same kinds of safety mechanisms that we might use. You may find yourself in a circumstance where you need to put that in your body to melt it or to reheat it. And so it's helpful to think about that. Maybe there's someone else that can use their body to warm the frozen formula while you're using your body to keep the baby warm. Or maybe you only need to warm a small amount of that with someone else's body, and then they can pass it on in small amounts for you to feed. Practically speaking, if you find yourself with the need to, as the power is going out, and as or maybe you're in a vehicle and it's very cold, and you're going to need to keep something from, it's going to freeze, you might want to think about putting it in small packages, in small containers before it gets, so that you can thaw it a little bit more easily.
The baby will not care that the bottle's been in your armpit, don't worry.
We have a comment here from someone who says, last year we lost power for almost a week and everything in my freezer was lost, including all the pumped milk. What can I do to prevent that if that ever happens again?
Yeah, this is another one of those things that that is something we in North America are needing to figure out, because it is not a phenomenon that happens in a lot of other places. The sort of the phenomenon of people having a freezer full of milk is not really all that common in a lot of the world. There's a couple things. One is, if you're losing power, keep that freezer door closed. Get your milk to the middle of the freezer, surround it with as much as you can, and then pack in either newspaper or other things around it. One little trick that we've picked up over the years is to put a glass of water in the freezer and put let it freeze, and then put a penny on top, so that you'll be able to tell if you leave. If that thaws and refreezes, you'll be able to see whether or not that water has refrozen. Because that's one of the things, if you've left your home, you might lose power for 4 or 5 days. The contents of the freezer melt, but then they refreeze again, and you might not be able to see that. So those are some of the little tips that you can pick up. If you need that milk, take out as much as you need for maybe 3 days, and leave the rest of it in the freezer. But after a week, it's going to be pretty difficult under any circumstances. The lucky thing is, if it is actually that cold outside, you can just put your milk outside. In a cooler or in a bag or in whatever. And that was something I think we heard lots of our colleagues, I think our friends in Newfoundland, because they had quite long power outages. And that was, we got some pictures of people that put their milk bags into the snowbanks out in front of their house, and just kind of crossed their fingers that nothing was going to get to it. So that is one of the advantages of being in a really cold climate, is nothing gets thawed.
Yeah. There are some small tips too. These are preparedness pieces. I don't know if everybody has, I'm a little obsessed with this, but I don't know if everybody else has a thermostat, a thermometer in their fridge, which will tell you, if it's the right temperature. And you can have a thermometer that goes in your freezer as well. That's really helpful if you're trying to establish what's the temperature outside. Is it really enough to keep something cold? How long has this been, at -5? That's a really inexpensive fix, and it can be helpful for peace of mind. But as Michelle said, the loss of a freezer stash is a really big loss for many. In a cold weather emergency, that may be less of an issue. But if you have to leave and you are worried about leaving your stash behind, or whether with you, the one thing we do ask people to consider is, please don't delay if you have to leave. If you're staying behind because you're worried about protecting your freezer stash, you don't want to be someone who has to evacuate through rising, freezing flood water with ice chunks in it. You want to be the person that's miles away, comfortably tucked away in a motel room by the side of the road, or even in your vehicle on dry land. You don't want to be delaying an evacuation because you want to protect your freezer stash. So if you, again, from a preparedness perspective, if you have a cooler, if you have if you have the ability to have a couple of blocks of ice that you keep in your freezer so that you can toss them into your cooler, or ice packs, so that if you do have to leave, you can take some milk with you. That's a good preparedness activity. And also maintaining lactation, even if you have decided you're going to go back to work, if you've decided that that it's time to wean. Breastfeeding just a little bit throughout a long period of time, it can be a really helpful preparedness piece, because it is actually, if you're still breastfeeding a little bit, it's a lot easier to breastfeed a little bit more and a little bit more than if you are no longer breastfeeding and you're relying on a stash of milk from your freezer, for example. So try to get people to think about, what are the seasonal hazards in your part of the world? You mentioned Newfoundland, Michelle. That's a place that does lose power often, where you have a lot of winter storms. If you're in an area where there are a lot of wildfires, if you experience a lot of different kinds of weather, on either of our coasts. If you're coming into the winter season, what we used to think of as flu season, I think now we're going to be calling it COVID season, but a time when there are additional, where there's always a lot of additional respiratory infections. It used to be the standard public health guidance out here on the prairie ago was, are you thinking of weaning? Is it November? Don't wean until spring. And that was a basic piece of health guidance that we advised mothers, we advised families to keep breastfeeding through that winter season when there's a higher risk of respiratory illness. So, some of these preparedness pieces are, some of them, I hate to say that they're common sense, because that's not really what it is. But it's really thinking about the people around you who may need to be supported to continue to breastfeed for a few more months, or who may need to be supported to do a little bit of preparedness work. And then for yourself, thinking about the kind of steps that you can take to make it easier for yourself and your family through the wildfire season, through the storm season, through the ice storm season.
Well, we have a comment here saying, so sad to have to prepare for the increase of climate disaster, but this is the reality, and that's unfortunate that we have to talk about all these things, because if we don't talk, it's like we are not able to do what we need to do, right? And it's important that we are all prepared, but also that the community in general is not just the mom and the baby and the father or the partner, but the community in general. So under any type of emergency, the call to action is for absolutely everybody. I think that we are all agents of change at this time. The healthcare facilities, the healthcare workers, the frontline responder, everybody's very, very busy because there's so much to attend to. So there's not that readiness. And I think that all of us as a society, and each one of us, has to be an agent of change, has to be able to understand the needs that society might need, be prepared for it, to be able to act, to be able to support, and especially a new life into this world, that it's so important. We want to make sure that we give a healthy future for that new baby, and that we give that baby all the love that we can do, but mostly that we have the common sense that we are talking about. I don't even know if we can call it common sense. Sorry, Jodine, I'm going to refer to that, because I think that on an emergency situation, there's no common sense anymore. And that's why the preparedness that we are talking about, that's why the preventative possibilities of everything that we can think of, just like what we do in the film production. I always say that if I am feeling good during the filming and the process of making the film, is because I had a very good pre-production. This is the same thing. We need a pre-production for everything we do. And right now we need to think about climate change. We need to think about what's happening, and we need to support the community at large. So I think that this brings us to an end of our conversation.
Yeah.
I don't know if the audience has anything else to ask. We are here, but we really welcome everybody to join us in the effort that we are doing. It's really grassroots at its best. We are going one by one, traveling with our equipments, with our things to the most obscure little places, to show the film, to talk about the film, to bring the voices of moms and babies from around the world, the voices of babies and professionals as well, and to have the wonderful work that Michelle and Jodine have prepared to be able to really prepare the frontline workers and everybody else to be ready just in case. Just in case. We are not calling for anything bad to happen, but it's good to know and be prepared. So I thank everybody, and please visit milkhood.com. Be in touch with our social media platforms, tell everybody about it, and help us spread the word, because we cannot do it alone. We need all of you. So thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very, very much, Noemi.
We hope
All right.
we'll see a few of you in the various places where we're coming.
Yes, all of
Absolutely.
you.
All right. Bye now.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.